The wind screamed against the old clapboard farmhouse, its icy breath finding every crack and crevice, slipping through the warped wooden window frames and sending shivers through the bones of the house. Snowflakes, sharp as needles, whipped against the glass, creating a constant hiss that filled every shadowed room. The world outside had vanished, swallowed whole by the blizzard that showed no mercy, no end. Inside, the fireplace in the corner of the living room offered a feeble resistance against the cold, its flames dancing and casting long, twisting shadows along the worn wallpaper. Thomas Grayson sat slumped in his armchair, a heavy knit blanket draped over his lap. His weathered hands, calloused and cracked from years of carpentry, cradled a steaming mug of tea that had long since gone cold. He didn't notice. His eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, were fixed on the photograph on the mantel. It was slightly askew, the frame tarnished with time, but the faces within were vivid. Two bright-eyed girls with wild curls, captured mid-laugh, their cheeks kissed by the summer sun. Next to them stood a woman with a smile like the dawn, her hand resting on Thomas's shoulder. The Grayson family, frozen in a perfect moment, a moment that had ended too soon. "Anna," he whispered, his voice a threadbare remnant of the man he used to be. "My sweet girls." It had been 8 years since the accident. A patch of black ice, a swerve, a crash. His wife and twin daughters, Emily and Sarah, had been gone in an instant, leaving Thomas adrift in a sea of grief. Since then, the house had become a mausoleum, a place where echoes of laughter lingered in the corners and shadows of memories slipped through his dreams. Outside, the storm raged on, its fury unrelenting. The wind battered the house, and for a moment, Thomas thought he heard a faint knocking. He blinked, the sound not quite piercing the fog of his thoughts. It came again, sharper this time, a desperate staccato rhythm against the front door. Thomas sat up, the blanket slipping to the floor. His joints protested as he rose, his knees cracking and his back seizing with pain. He shuffled through the dimly lit hallway, past the staircase where tiny handprints still marked the banister. His breath clouded the cold air as he reached the door, his fingers trembling as he turned the lock. The wind yanked the door open, slamming it against the wall with a thunderous crash. Snow spiraled into the foyer, biting at his skin. Squinting against the blinding white, Thomas's heart stumbled to a halt. 2 tiny figures stood on his porch, their outlines blurred by the storm. As the wind died down for a moment, he saw them clearly. 2 little girls, barefoot and clad only in thin nightgowns, their skin blue with cold. Their dark curls clung to their faces, and their wide, tearful eyes were rimmed with frost. "Please," the taller of the 2 whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the tempest. "Help us." Before he could respond, the smaller girl's knees gave out. She crumpled to the snow-covered porch, her lips a frightening shade of blue. Instinct overrode thought. Thomas surged forward, his arms wrapping around the unconscious child, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. The other girl stumbled after him, her tiny hands clutching the fabric of his jacket. Inside, he kicked the door shut, cutting off the wind's furious howl. The silence was immediate and oppressive, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and the labored breathing of the girls. Thomas laid the unconscious child on the old leather couch, her damp curls splaying across the cushions. He turned to the other girl who stood shivering by the door, her bare feet leaving wet prints on the hardwood floor. "What happened?" he asked gently, pulling a blanket from the armchair and wrapping it around her fragile shoulders. "Where are your parents?" She didn't answer. Instead, her eyes never left her sister's still form, a raw fear etched into her tiny features. Thomas's mind raced. He grabbed another blanket, tucking it around the unconscious girl, and then moved to the closet. His hands fumbled through old boxes until he found what he needed, a first aid kit, a heating pad, anything that might help. As he worked, gently rubbing warmth back into the girl's limbs, flashes of his daughters tore through his mind. Emily with her scraped knees and boundless energy. Sarah, always the quieter twin, hiding behind her sister when strangers came too close. His chest ached, a hollow, familiar pain. "What are your names?" he asked again, his voice softer this time. "I'm Lily," the conscious girl murmured. "That's my sister, Rose." Lily and Rose. The names hung in the air, delicate and fragile. Thomas nodded, his hands never stopping their careful ministrations. "Where are your parents?" "Lily." She looked up at him, her eyes far too old for her tiny face. "We don't have any." Her words were a knife, sharp and precise. Thomas felt the slice of it, the echo of his own loss vibrating through him. "Have you been out in the storm all night?" Lily nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around her. "We were looking for somewhere warm. Everywhere else was dark. Then we saw your light." Thomas's throat tightened. His house was the last on the edge of town. If they hadn't reached him, he couldn't finish the thought. Rose stirred, a weak moan slipping past her pale lips. Thomas leaned closer, relief flooding him as her eyelids fluttered. She opened her eyes, glassy and unfocused, and then, as if sensing her sister's presence, she reached out blindly. Lily was there in an instant, climbing onto the couch and wrapping her arms around Rose. The two girls clung to each other, their breaths mingling in soft clouds. Thomas sank into the armchair, his legs too weak to hold him. His mind whirled with questions. How had they ended up alone in a storm like this? What had happened to them? But beneath the questions was a deeper, more terrifying feeling. These girls, these lost, broken children, looked so much like his own. The resemblance was uncanny. The same delicate features, the same deep, soulful eyes. It was as if Emily and Sarah had walked out of his memories and into his living room. Tears blurred his vision, and he let them fall. He hadn't cried in years, not when they died, not through the lonely nights that followed. But now, with these two little miracles in front of him, the dam broke. He wept for his daughters, for the life he had lost, and for these two tiny souls who had found their way to him through the storm. As the fire crackled and the wind shrieked outside, Thomas Grayson sat with his grief and his hope, tangled together in a knot that pulsed with life. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt something stir within him, a flicker of warmth, fragile but real, like the first glow of dawn after the longest night. The storm had calmed to a mournful whisper by the time dawn painted the edges of the sky in muted grays and blues. The house remained a pocket of stillness, insulated from the world by walls thick with memories and a hearth that had burned low but steady through the night. Thomas sat slumped in the armchair, the blanket now draped over his shoulders. His eyes, bloodshot and heavy, had not closed once since he had brought the girls inside. He had kept vigil, his thoughts circling like vultures over the mysteries that lay before him. On the couch, Lily and Rose slept, their small bodies entwined under layers of blankets. In sleep, they looked impossibly fragile, their cheeks, now flushed with warmth, a stark contrast to the deathly pallor they'd worn when they first arrived. Thomas had draped a quilt over them, one his late wife, Anna, had sewn by hand. He hadn't touched it in years. He rose slowly, the stiffness in his joints more pronounced after a night of stillness. The kitchen was dark, the air cold against his skin. He moved through the motions of making tea, his hands finding the kettle, the tin of loose leaves, the delicate porcelain cups. The ritual steadied him, each small act an anchor in the storm of his mind. When the kettle whistled, sharp and sudden, it jolted him back to the present. He poured the tea, the amber liquid swirling, and then added a splash of milk, just as he used to for his girls when they would sit with him on quiet Sunday mornings. His heart clenched, the echo of their giggles brushing against his frayed edges. A soft sound pulled him back to the living room. Rose stirred, her small hand slipping free of the blankets. Her eyelids fluttered, and then she was awake, her gaze wide and glassy, a deer in the headlights. "Good morning," Thomas said gently, setting the tea on the coffee table. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Rose blinked, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Lily, sensing her sister's wakefulness even in sleep, opened her eyes and immediately pulled Rose into a tight embrace. "It's okay," Lily whispered, her voice a soothing melody. "We're safe." Thomas felt a pang, the depth of Lily's love for her sister both beautiful and heartbreaking. These were not ordinary children. Their silence held weight, their eyes secrets. "Would you like some tea?" he asked, crouching down to their level. "Or maybe something to eat?" Lily nodded hesitantly. "Do you have toast?" Thomas managed a smile. "I think I can manage that." He retreated to the kitchen, his mind already cataloging what he had in the pantry. The old bread, a jar of strawberry jam, maybe some butter if it hadn't gone bad. He hadn't shopped properly in weeks. The world outside his home felt too vast, too filled with reminders of what he had lost. When he returned, a tray balanced in his hands, the girls were sitting up, huddled together under the quilt. He set the tray down, the toast golden and the jam spread in uneven patches. The girls reached for it, their movements careful but quick, as if they feared it might vanish. Thomas watched as they ate, his mind buzzing with questions. Where had they come from? How had they ended up on his porch in the middle of a blizzard? And why did they look so much like his own daughters, gone these 8 long years? When the plates were empty and the tea had gone cold, Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Lily, Rose, can you tell me where you came from?" Lily set her teacup down, her fingers still wrapped around it as if for comfort. "We were at a house," she began, her voice small, "with lots of other kids, but it wasn't home." Rose shivered, and Thomas reached for another blanket, tucking it around her shoulders. His touch was met with a fleeting, grateful glance. "Was it a shelter?" he asked. "An orphanage?" Lily nodded. "It was cold there, too, and they said we couldn't stay." A rush of anger flared in Thomas's chest. "They put you out in the storm. They said they had no room." Lily's voice wavered, and her small shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. "We were supposed to wait for someone to take us, but," Rose whispered, "we were scared." Thomas's fists clenched, the betrayal cutting deep. "You did the right thing," he said firmly. "You found safety. You found me." The girls exchanged a look, something unspoken passing between them. Lily bit her lip. "Do you want us to leave?" "No." The word came out harsher than he intended. "No, you're staying right here, as long as you need." Relief washed over their faces, and for a moment, Thomas thought he saw the flicker of a smile. "Thank you," Lily said, her voice no louder than the crackle of the dying fire. Thomas nodded, his mind already racing. He would call the authorities, find out where they belonged, make sure they were safe. But beneath the logic, a whisper of something else stirred, a selfish, desperate hope. Perhaps they belonged here. As the morning light filtered through the frosted windows, touching the room in soft gold, Thomas felt the smallest bloom of warmth. It was fragile, as delicate as the frost patterns on the glass, but it was real. For the first time in years, the old house felt alive. The sun climbed higher, painting the snow-blanketed world in harsh, reflective light. The storm had left everything draped in quiet, but inside Thomas's old Victorian home, the stillness had given way to the soft hum of life. The girls sat on the rug in front of the fireplace, their small figures hallowed by the golden glow of the embers. Rose had found a set of wooden blocks that had sat untouched in an antique chest for years. The edges were worn smooth, the colors faded, but to the twins, they were treasures. Thomas watched from the kitchen doorway, his heart a tangled knot of emotions. Their laughter, a soft, tentative sound, pricked at something inside him, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. It was like sunlight piercing through clouds, both beautiful and unsettling. He had called the local authorities that morning, his voice low and steady as he explained the situation. The woman on the other end had sounded concerned, asking him to keep the girls safe and warm until someone could come by. But there had been hesitation, a strained edge to her words. The roads were still impassable, the storm having crippled most of the small town. It might be days before help could arrive. Days. Thomas had hung up the phone with a strange mixture of dread and relief. He should have been anxious to have strangers in his home, to keep children who were not his, but instead, he felt something wholly unexpected, a sense of purpose. He busied himself making soup, the broth simmering on the stove. His hands moved through the motions, chopping vegetables, stirring, tasting, but his mind remained on the girls. They were too quiet, too careful. Children their age should have been boisterous, curious, but these two, they moved like ghosts, as if afraid their very presence might shatter the fragile peace. The sound of something clattering to the floor pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Rose standing over a spilled cup, her eyes wide, lips trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words tight with fear. Before Thomas could move, Lily darted to her sister's side, her arms wrapping protectively around her. "We'll clean it up," she said quickly. "Please, don't be mad." The air shifted, cold seeping into the room despite the fire's warmth. Thomas felt a chill crawl up his spine. He dropped the spoon into the pot and hurried over, crouching down so he was at eye level with them. Hey, it's okay," he soothed, his voice gentle. "It's just a cup. No harm done." The girls remained tense, their small bodies rigid. Lily's grip on Rose tightened, and Thomas saw the shadows of something dark and heavy behind their eyes. "It was an accident," he continued. "Nobody's in trouble." Rose's eyes filled with tears, her lip quivering. "Really?" Thomas's chest tightened. "Really?" He reached out slowly, giving them time to pull away. But when his hand rested on Rose's shoulder, she didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into him, her small frame trembling. Lily followed, her arms still looped around her sister, and together they sank against him. Thomas wrapped his arms around them, his touch light but firm, creating a cocoon of safety. He felt their breaths sync with his, the ragged edges of fear softening with each exhale. They stayed like that for a long time, the only sounds the soft crackle of the fire and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock. When they finally pulled away, Rose's cheeks were damp, but her expression had gentled. Lily's eyes were still wary, but a spark of trust glimmered there. "Why were you so scared?" Thomas asked softly, not wanting to push but needing to understand. The girls exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Lily spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "At the place we were before, if we broke something, they'd get mad," she said. "Sometimes they'd lock us in the dark." A spike of anger flared in Thomas's chest. "Who did this to you?" Rose's small hands twisted in the hem of her sweater. "The ladies. They said we had to be good. That nobody wants bad girls." Thomas's vision blurred, his hands curling into fists against the flood of emotions. How could anyone treat them this way? He had seen pain before, in the eyes of his own daughters when illness had stolen their childhoods, but this was different. This was inflicted, deliberate. "You are not bad," he said, his voice firm but kind. "You are brave. You are good. And you are safe here." The words seemed to seep into the room, filling the cracks with warmth. The girls nodded, their shoulders easing, and Thomas felt the shift, a tiny, precious step toward healing. The rest of the day unfolded gently. They played games, their laughter growing bolder, and when the soup was finally ready, they ate with eager, unguarded hunger. Thomas told them stories, tales of his own childhood, of the adventures he had once shared with his daughters. He left out the sad parts, focusing on joy, on hope. By evening, the house had transformed. Where there had been silence, there was now life. The shadows had retreated, the rooms filled with the soft, steady rhythm of a family, if only for a moment. As he tucked them into the spare bed, their small hands clutching his, Thomas felt the weight of their trust settle over him. It was fragile, a gift he hadn't expected, but it was real. When the girls drifted off to sleep, their faces smooth and untroubled, he sat by the window, staring out into the dark. The snow had begun to fall again, a quiet hush over the world. Somewhere out there were answers, truths that needed to be uncovered, justice that needed to be served. But for now, in this pocket of warmth and light, Thomas allowed himself to hope. Because maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. The storm returned with a vengeance that night, snow hammering against the windows and wind howling through the eaves. The house, though old and creaky, held strong, a steadfast refuge against the chaos outside. Thomas sat at the small writing desk in his bedroom, the dim light of a dusty lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The room, untouched for years, had once been a place of solace. Now it was a war room, a space where he could piece together the fractured puzzle of the girl's past. The tea in his cup had gone cold, but he didn't notice. His hands trembled, not from the chill, but from the weight of the revelations he had uncovered. In front of him lay a stack of printouts, hastily scrawled notes, and an old photo album he had unearthed from the attic. When the girls had fallen asleep, their breaths soft and steady, he had slipped into action. His first call had been to the local police, not the emergency line, but the direct number for Detective Laura Bishop, a woman he trusted, who had been there for him when grief had nearly swallowed him whole. Thomas. Her voice had been groggy, the early hour weighing heavily. "What's going on?" "There are 2 little girls here," he had said, keeping his voice low. "They showed up on my porch last night. And Laura, something isn't right." Her tone sharpened, the sleep slipping away. "Are they safe? Are you safe?" "They're safe, but I need your help. I need to know where they came from." Laura had promised to look into it, but her resources were limited. The storm had cut off most of the town, and communication lines were spotty. Still, she would try. Thomas had hung up, and then turned to the internet, his fingers clumsy on the old keyboard. He searched for missing children, for reports of orphanages or shelters nearby. What he found made his blood run cold. A headline from 6 months ago: "Mystery deepens as children vanish from foster home." He clicked through, his eyes scanning the article. The foster home, Miller House, was less than 20 miles away. It had been shut down following allegations of neglect and abuse. Several children had been removed, but 2 had gone missing in the chaos. Twin girls, aged 4, named Lily and Rose Harper. He felt the world tilt, a sickening lurch in his stomach. He scrolled further, finding a grainy photograph. 2 girls, their faces pale and solemn, stood in the doorway of a crumbling brick building. Their dark hair framed their round faces, their expressions caught somewhere between fear and hope. It was them. Thomas's hands clenched the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. How had they ended up here? Why hadn't they been found? And who had let them slip through the cracks of a system meant to protect them? He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. His reflection in the window startled him, a tired old man with haunted eyes. But beneath the exhaustion lay something sharper: determination. He needed answers. The morning brought a fragile calm. The storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in white. The sky was a pale, bruised gray, and the air hummed with the quiet of a world not yet awake. Thomas found the girls in the kitchen, perched on stools too tall for them, their feet swinging beneath the table. They were nibbling on slices of bread, the crumbs dusting their blankets. When they saw him, their faces brightened, and a warmth unfurled in his chest. "Good morning," he greeted, forcing his voice into something gentle. "Morning," Lily mumbled, her mouth full. Rose offered a shy wave, her fingers sticky with jam. He joined them, pouring himself a cup of coffee. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crunch of toast and the soft murmur of the old refrigerator. Thomas set his cup down, the ceramic clinking against the wood. "Girls, I need to ask you something." Their chewing slowed, eyes lifting to meet his. "Do you remember Miller House?" The effect was immediate. Lily's fingers tightened around the crust of her bread, and Rose's eyes widened, a shadow crossing her small face. "That place was bad," Rose whispered. "They told us we weren't good enough," Lily added, her voice a tight coil. "They said nobody wanted us." Thomas's hands curled into fists beneath the table. He forced himself to breathe, to stay steady. "How did you get away?" "We hid," Lily said. "When they took the other kids, we hid under the stairs. They didn't find us." Rose's lip quivered. "We were so hungry. We waited for days. When no one came, we left." Thomas reached out, placing his hands over theirs. "You did the right thing. You were so brave." The weight of their words settled over him. These tiny souls had endured so much: abandonment, neglect, fear, and yet they had found their way to him. "I called a friend," he said gently. "She's going to help us figure this out. Make sure you're safe." Lily's eyes narrowed. "Will they take us away?" Thomas hesitated. "I don't know. But I won't let anything bad happen to you. I promise." The room seemed to hold its breath, the fire in the hearth a soft whisper behind them. Finally, Rose slid off her stool and climbed into his lap, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "We trust you." Lily followed, curling against his side. Thomas held them, his own heart aching with the depth of his promise. Whatever happened next, he would not fail them. Later, as the snow began to melt and drip from the eaves, a car pulled into the driveway. Detective Laura Bishop stepped out, her boots crunching over the frozen ground. She moved with purpose, her expression grim but kind. Thomas opened the door before she knocked, his shoulders squared. The girls peeked out from behind him, their small faces peering over the edge of the quilt they had wrapped themselves in. "Thomas," Laura greeted, her breath misting in the cold air. "And you must be Lily and Rose." The girls nodded, their eyes wide, but not afraid. Laura knelt, her movements slow, keeping her voice soft. "I'm here to help. I promise." The warmth of the house enveloped them as Laura stepped inside. The fire crackled, and the girls settled onto the couch, their small bodies pressed together. Thomas felt a rush of gratitude. For Laura, for the warmth, for the chance to make things right. And as the sun pushed through the clouds, casting the room in soft light, he knew this was only the beginning. The truth had finally come to light, but the real fight was just beginning. The sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the snow with hues of amber and violet. The warmth of the day, fleeting as it was, gave way to a biting chill. The wind had calmed, leaving the world in a muffled stillness, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Inside the old Victorian home, the fire crackled softly, its glow casting long, dancing shadows across the worn wooden floors. Detective Laura Bishop sat at the kitchen table, her notepad filled with hastily scribbled notes. Her brow furrowed as she flipped through pages of printouts and reports, her lips moving slightly as she read. Thomas stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the dimming light. His breath fogged the glass, and he absently traced patterns in the condensation. Circles, spirals, the names of his lost children. The habit, long buried, resurfaced like a ghost. The twins, Lily and Rose, lay curled on the couch under a quilt, their faces slack with the peacefulness only sleep could bring. Their breathing was synchronized, a soft and rhythmic sound that filled the quiet of the room. The weight of their presence pressed on Thomas's chest, equal parts comfort and sorrow. "They were never officially reported missing," Laura said, her voice breaking through his thoughts. Thomas turned, his expression a mix of confusion and anger. "What do you mean?" She tapped the papers in front of her. According to these records, the Miller House foster home claimed all the children were relocated when the state shut them down. But there's no mention of the twins. It's like they never existed. "That's impossible." His voice was a low rumble, the storm inside him barely contained. I found the article. I saw their names. You did, she agreed. But the official documents tell a different story. Whoever was running Miller House must have falsified records. These girls slipped through the cracks, and nobody even noticed. Thomas's hands tightened around the edge of the windowsill. The wood groaned under the pressure. So, what happens now? Laura sighed, rubbing her temples. We need to dig deeper. I've already reached out to social services, but it could take time. There are complications. What kind of complications? The former manager of Miller House, a woman named Eleanor Grant, disappeared shortly after the closure. There were allegations, money laundering, child neglect, abuse, but nothing stuck. She vanished, and so did any hope of bringing her to justice. The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. He remembered Eleanor, her sharp features, her cold eyes, the way she had looked down her nose at him all those years ago. She had been the social worker assigned to his case when he and his late wife had tried to adopt. She was the one who told us no, he murmured, the memory surfacing with painful clarity. She said we weren't fit to be parents. Laura's eyes widened. You knew her. Thomas nodded, his voice raw. She said our grief made us unstable, that we needed to move on from losing our own children before we could give a home to another. Laura's pen stopped moving, the weight of the revelation settling over them both. If she was capable of that, then there's no telling what else she did. A soft whimper drew their attention. Rose stirred, her small hand clutching the edge of the quilt. No, please, don't. Thomas moved to her side, his large hands gentle as he smoothed her hair back. Shay, sweetheart, you're safe. Rose's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. She'll find us, she whispered. She always finds us. A cold shiver ran down Thomas's spine. Who, Rose? Who will find you? The bad lady, Lily said, her voice suddenly awake, sharp with fear. She sat up, pulling the quilt closer. She took the others. She said if we told, she'd take us too. Laura leaned forward, her expression gentle but intent. What did she do, Lily? Can you tell me? The girl hesitated, her small fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. She made the kids go away. At night, she'd come into the room and take them. They never came back. Thomas felt his heart splinter. He had seen horrors in his own life, but nothing compared to the darkness in Lily's eyes. Did she hurt you? Laura asked softly. Lily shook her head. No, but only because we hid. Rose made us hide. Rose's lip trembled. I didn't want to go with the bad lady. I wanted to find Mommy and Daddy. Thomas's vision blurred. He pulled them both into his arms, their small bodies fitting against him like they were always meant to be there. Laura stood, her expression hardening. I need to make some calls. If Eleanor Grant is still out there, these girls aren't safe. Thomas nodded, his voice thick. Do whatever you need to. I won't let anyone take them. As Laura stepped outside to get a better signal, Thomas remained on the floor, cradling the twins. The fire cast long shadows, and in the quiet, he could almost hear the echo of his own children's laughter, soft, distant, a reminder of what he had lost. But in the warmth of the girls' embrace, he found a spark of hope. His story wasn't over, and neither was theirs. He would fight for them, protect them, give them the life they deserved. No more shadows, no more hiding. For the first time in decades, Thomas felt his purpose align with his heart. The miracle he had never expected had arrived on his doorstep, cold, shivering, and in need of love, and he would not let it slip through his fingers. The snow had ceased, leaving behind a world painted in white. The sharp edges of reality had softened under nature's blanket, but inside the old Victorian house, the tension remained sharp and biting. Detective Laura Bishop had returned with grim news, her face pale and her expression tight. She's still out there, Laura said, her voice low but urgent. Eleanor Grant. She's been using aliases, moving from town to town. There are reports of children going missing wherever she's been. Thomas felt the floor sway beneath him. He tightened his grip on the twins, who sat nestled against him on the couch. The warmth of their small bodies was the only thing anchoring him to the moment. "What do we do?" His voice trembled, a mix of fear and determination. "We keep them safe," Laura replied, "but we need to move fast. If she realizes they're here, she might try to take them back." The mere thought of it sent a cold rush through Thomas's veins. His home, once a sanctuary, now felt exposed, a glass house in the path of a storm. The girls seemed to sense the shift. Rose looked up at him, her large eyes brimming with fear. "Are we going away again?" "No," Thomas said firmly. "You're not going anywhere. Not without me." Lily's fingers twisted into his shirt, her voice a fragile whisper. "Promise." "I promise." Laura moved to the window, parting the curtains just enough to peer outside. The street lay empty, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. But shadows lingered in every corner. "We need a plan," she said, turning back to them. "If Eleanor is as dangerous as I suspect, she won't come alone." "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, his pulse quickening. "She's been involved in human trafficking," Laura said, her expression hardening. "The reports I've pulled up link her to a network that exploits vulnerable children. She takes them from the system, and they vanish. She's not just a threat. She's a predator." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. "And these girls?" "They're survivors," Laura finished. "But if she finds them, they might not be for long." Silence settled over them, thick and suffocating. The fire had burned low, the embers glowing like dying stars. "What do you need me to do?" Thomas asked, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Laura's lips pressed into a thin line. "Pack a bag. Essentials only. We're leaving tonight." "Where will we go?" "There's a safe house about an hour from here. I can call in a favor. It's off the grid. No records, no connections to your name. It's the best chance we have." The girls began to tremble, their fear palpable. Thomas gathered them closer, murmuring soft reassurances as he rose from the couch. "Come on, girls. Let's get your things." They moved through the house quickly, Thomas filling a duffel bag with warm clothes, blankets, and the few cherished keepsakes he couldn't bear to leave behind. The girls each held a small stuffed animal, worn and frayed, but clearly loved. In the kitchen, Laura packed snacks, water, and a first aid kit. She moved with practiced efficiency, her training evident in every motion. "I've called for backup," she said over her shoulder. "But with the storm damage, it might take time. We need to be gone before she gets here." Thomas nodded, his mind racing. The old house, with all its memories, felt like it was slipping away. But nothing mattered more than the safety of the twins. As they prepared to leave, a sound cut through the quiet. A car engine, low and rumbling. Laura's head snapped up. She moved to the window, her body tense. "Stay back," she hissed, pulling her service weapon from its holster. The car rolled to a stop at the end of the driveway. Its headlights washed over the front of the house, blinding and cold. The silhouette of a woman stood behind the beams, her form distorted by the light. Thomas' stomach turned. Even without seeing her face, he knew Eleanor Grant had found them. "Get the girls to the back room," Laura whispered. "Now." Thomas obeyed, scooping Lily and Rose into his arms. Their small hands clung to him, their fear tangible. He moved down the hallway, his feet barely touching the floor as he slipped into the pantry at the back of the house. The room was cramped and dark, shelves lined with canned goods and old linens. He settled the girls on the floor, pulling blankets around them. "Stay quiet," he whispered. "No matter what happens, don't come out until I say so." Rose's lip quivered. "But what if the bad lady—" "She won't take you," he said fiercely. "I won't let her." Outside, voices rose. Laura's sharp and commanding, Eleanor's oily and calm. The clash of good and evil, right on his doorstep. A crash echoed through the house, followed by the heavy thud of footsteps. The walls seemed to close in, the air turning stale. Thomas braced himself, his body a shield between the girls and whatever horror might come through that door. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one an eternity. Then, a soft shuffle. He held his breath. "Thomas." Laura's voice, rough but alive. "It's over." He pushed the door open, light spilling into the pantry. Laura stood in the hallway, a bruise blooming on her cheek, but her expression triumphant. "She's in custody." The backup arrived just in time. Relief hit him like a wave. He turned to the girls, his smile breaking through the shadows. "We're safe. She's gone." The twins flung themselves into his arms, their sobs mingling with his own. It was a release of all the fear, all the pain, a promise of healing. The house, battered and weary, stood witness to a new chapter. In the days that followed, the story unfolded. A tale of corruption and greed, of innocence lost and found. Eleanor Grant would face justice, and the network she served would crumble under the weight of the truth. But for Thomas and the twins, the real victory lay in the quiet moments, in the warmth of a home filled with laughter, in the safety of arms that would never let go. They became a family, not by blood, but by choice, by love. And as spring melted the last of the snow, flowers bloomed where the ice had once held the world in its grip. Because sometimes, even in the darkest storms, light finds a way through.